a man who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Coffee comes in a variety of sizes and colors. I order mine black with room for more coffee. I like coffee with my coffee. Julio at Organic Man Coffee Trike makes such good coffee, it should only be consumed with itself. Well, there are folks who just have to add things to their coffee to change the taste, maybe. Uh, they don't actually like coffee? Oh well, drink it as you like, as long as you drink only the best. The best coffee in the universe, that is. 4501 McPherson here in Laredo, or organicmancoffeetrike.shop for the rest of y'all. I don't know how I got on the subject of crooks that were nicer than the authorities. It just popped into my head. Over the centuries, there have been those who did bad things, but for the right reasons. There were also those who, under the guise of the law, were out and out scoundrels. Hollywood has made many nice pieces of work into the underdogs who were supposed to be loved and cherished by the rest of us. Most of these heroes were actually villains that had no business receiving any of our love or even our likes. Way back, we went to see the movie Bonnie and Clyde at the theater. My dad kind of liked the movie, lots of violence, but my mom thought it was a bunch of hooey. Well, that's not the word she used, but she didn't much care for the movie or the characters or the way they were portrayed or the way the story was told on the big screen. She said it was nowhere near accurate. I wondered why until I got old enough to do my own history research. On the night of April 30th, 1932, John Napoleon Butcher was murdered by the Barrow Gang. He owned a store in Hillsboro, Texas. The story goes Barrow had visited the store a few times and he'd seen a big safe in the back. He, along with 2 accomplices, drove down from Dallas to rob the store. They called John to come down and sell them some guitar strings, and during the transaction, John began to suspect that something was not right. Something was rotten in Denmark, as it were. John moved over to his desk to get his pistol, and when he opened the drawer, one of the Barrow Gang shot and killed him. The men fled, after which it was said that this was Clyde Barrow's first time involved in a murder, but nowhere near his last. My mother's family name is Butcher. The movie portrayed a pair as if they were just a couple of young kids that got on the wrong side of the law. John Dillinger said Bonnie and Clyde were giving bank robbers a bad name. They tended to shoot anybody they even mildly suspected of being on the side of the law. They shot police officers who hadn't even taken notice of them. They were trigger-happy killers. I'm not doing a show about folks like them. I'm going to dig into some outlaws who had a kind heart, if not a shaky grasp on the rules. Robert Leroy Parker was born April 13th, 1866, in Beaver, Utah Territory, the first of 13 children of English immigrants, Maximilian Parker and Anne Campbell Giles. The Parker family had converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we sometimes call them Mormons, while still living in the United Kingdom. Robert Parker grew up on his parents' ranch near Circleville. Parker fled his home as a teenager, and while working in a dairy ranch, he met cattle thief Mike Cassidy. I don't know what she's barking at. She does that. He met Mike Cassidy. Working as a butcher, Robert began answering to the name Butch. Later, he took on the last name of his mentor, Cassidy. Butch Cassidy's first criminal offense was minor and somewhat weird. Around 1880, he went to a clothing store in the next town over, only to discover that the place was closed. He broke into the shop and stole a pair of jeans and some pie. Not being a very good thief, he left an IOU, promising to pay for his ill-gotten gains on his next visit. The store owner pressed charges, but Cassidy was found not guilty by the jury. Probably not guilty for reasons of he didn't know what he was doing. You don't leave an IOU if you're robbing a place. Cassidy's first bank robbery took place June 24th, 1889, when he and a man named Warner and two of the McCarty brothers robbed the San Miguel Valley Bank in Telluride. I almost called it by the other name, Telluride. To make good their escape, they simply rode out of town, soon followed by the posse. Butch had the advantage of being a very smart individual, and he outwitted the law. As the gang got out of town, they jumped on to some fresh horses that they had left there earlier. They rode away, now on fresh mounts, as the posse came loping along behind them. Within a few hours, they did the same trick again, now on fresh horses, while the posse was still riding the same horses that they had run out of town on. The gang was soon so far away the posse had no option other than to turn back home empty-handed. Butch Cassidy and his gang wound up in Robber's Roost with about $21,000, the equivalent of $700,000 in today's currency. 1890, Cassidy purchased a ranch on the outskirts of Dubois, Wyoming. His ranch was across the state from the notorious Hole in the Wall, a natural geological formation and a popular hideout for outlaw gangs. He was not the only one that used it. Even as a ranch owner, Cassidy was still looking for his next big score. Why work hard doing the honest things when stealing was so much easier and quicker? On Thanksgiving, Butch paid for a huge dinner for all the people living in and around Dubois. He was generous with the cash he had. He also made sure that he never broke the law in his own area. While the sheriffs and marshals were looking for him in and around Telluride, Butch was maybe not liked by the sheriff in his own area, but he was at least respected. The townsfolk all loved him. In early 1894, Cassidy became involved romantically with a rancher and an outlaw named Ann Bassett. Her father was a rancher who did business with Cassidy, supplying him with fresh horses and beef. Cassidy was arrested in Lander, Wyoming for stealing horses and running a protection racket among the local ranchers. This would have been one more example of his mind at work. Why steal the horses when you can promise to not steal them for a small fee. He was imprisoned in the Wyoming State Prison in Laramie. He served 18 months of a 2-year sentence. Butch was released and pardoned in January 1896 by the governor. Cassidy associated with other criminals, one being his close friend William Ellsworth Lay, also known as Kid Curry. The gang began using the name the Wild Bunch. The name was not theirs alone. The Doolin-Dalton gang was also known as the Wild Bunch. There was also that 1969 movie called The Wild Bunch with what has to be the greatest ending shootout in any movie. If you haven't seen it, now's your chance. You can just watch the ending if that will suffice, but the whole movie is gritty and worth seeing. The Wild Bunch managed to stay out of jail by keeping the local populace on their side. They didn't steal money from citizens, only the big fish, banks, trains, and huge companies. Sometime in 1896, Cassidy brought in Harry Longbow, better known as the Sundance Kid. The gang would plan the robberies very carefully, scoping out the town where the sheriff's office was, how many deputies he had on hand, and when the deputies were usually available. They would check the timing of any large shipments coming or going by rail, or any big deposits being made by companies. Gold and silver had to be transported from one place to another. Small bits of intel gathered over the weeks or months all added up to a sizable haul, as well as a clean getaway. Many crooks of the time would rob one town and show up in another to celebrate, which meant lots of drinking and yelling and screaming and bragging about what they did. It's amazing how alcohol will loosen up your lips. The locals would become suspicious of a bunch of drunken cowboys with more money than sense. The sheriff or the marshal would get involved, and somebody was bound to wind up in jail, if not dead. Butch would take the gang back to the hole in the wall, and then they would stay there, allowing the heat to turn down. If need be, the gang would split up, going their separate ways, only to join back up at a predetermined time and location. June 2nd, 1899, the gang robbed the Union Pacific Overland Flyer, which was a passenger train near Wilcox, Wyoming. They weren't interested in what the passengers had in the way of cash. The train was carrying a huge sum of gold and silver, the real prize. The owners of the rail were somewhat, no, they were a whole lot upset by having their train robbed. They began putting pressure on the local authorities, and they brought in a private company to get to the bottom of the robbery and make sure that Butch paid, and his gang as well. Bank or train robbers were well known in many locations. Just riding into town was sometimes the last thing they accomplished. Kid Curry and George Curry had a shootout with lawmen following the train robbery. They killed Sheriff Joe Hazen. Tom Horn was a killer for hire who was employed by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. He was an American scout, cowboy, soldier, range detective, and a Pinkerton agent in the 19th and early 20th century. Horn is believed to have committed at least 17 killings as a hired gunman all throughout the West. There are These are just the ones that he had admitted to. There are many shootings that are suspected to have been his, but never proven. A hired killer wasn't there to arrest and take anybody to trial. Their job was to do away with anyone getting under the skin of those who were paying them. Following the Civil War, the Pinkertons began conducting operations against organized labor, better known as unions. During the labor strikes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, businesses hired the Pinkerton Agency to infiltrate unions, supply guards, keep strikers and suspected unionists out of factories, and recruit goon squads to intimidate workers. In the late 1874, the Pinkertons learned that Jesse and Frank James periodically returned home to visit their family in Clay County, Missouri. On the night of January 26, 1875, a gang of Pinkerton agents surrounded the Jameses' farm in the mistaken belief that Jesse and his brother Frank were inside. In an attempt to flush the outlaws out of the house, the gang threw several flares through the windows. Unexpectedly, one of the flares exploded, instantly killing Frank and Jesse's younger half brother and blowing their mother's arm off. Though the identity of these Pinkerton gang members have never been determined with absolute certainty, contemporary admirers of the James brothers and modern day historians all agree that the Pinkertons were to blame. Regardless, the incident gave credence to the popular view that the men were innocent victims of a powerful railroads that had hired the Pinkertons to kill them. The agency was willing to kill or maim in order to enforce their version of the law. Jesse James's mother and half brother are a good example of their bad dealings. Jesse James and his gang spent a lot of their time in Missouri. They were known to a lot of folks living around there, and most considered them to be decent, hardworking crooks. They only stole from banks and railroads. Stopping off at a farmhouse, the gang was treated to lunch one day, eating most of what the owner had. Jesse found out that the widow who lived on the farm was about to lose it to the bank. He gave the woman the amount owed, instructing her that she had to be absolutely certain to get a receipt after paying the banker. The banker, more overjoyed to get the money instead of having to foreclose, he would then have to find somebody to buy this broke down farm, more work than he wanted to do. He arrived at the farm. The banker took the money, handed over a sheet of paper that said paid in full. Riding back to town, the banker was ambushed by a gang of robbers, one of whom just happened to be Jesse James, and they relieved him of $1,500. The James gang had a reputation for checking people's hands while robbing trains. Folks with calloused hands were workers and they got to keep their money, whereas anybody with smooth bankers' hands, well, they were robbed. John Ford was working for the Pinkertons when he shot and killed Jesse James. When the folks on the side of the law are willing to break the law to uphold it, things are definitely rotten. The bank robbers are breaking the law, and the law enforcement are breaking the law as well to catch them. What choice does the working man have of staying in the middle and not getting into trouble? As more and more law enforcement agents began looking for them, Cassidy and Sundance packed their few possessions and headed to New York City, hiding behind enemy lines as it was. They saw the sights, they ate at the best restaurants before setting sail for Buenos Aires, Argentina. The long arm of the law shouldn't be able to arrest them once out of the country. Once on the far side of the equator, Cassidy bought a 15,000-acre ranch with a four-room log cabin on the east bank of the Rio Blanco near Cholila, just east of the Andes in Chubut. From there, the story gets a bit muddled. In 1905, two English-speaking bandits held up the Banco de Tarapaca y Argentina in Rio Gallegos. My Spanish is starting to slip very bad. The pair took the money and they headed north into the Patagonian grasslands. Cassidy and Sundance sold the Cholila Ranch. They knew that the long arm of the law had located them at last. After the bank robbery, Governor Julio Lozana had issued an arrest warrant for the pair. Sheriff Edward Humphreys, a Welsh Argentinian who was friendly with Cassidy, tipped them off. Agent Frank DeMoya of the Pinkerton Agency had known of their location for some time. The snow and the hard winter of the Patagonia had prevented him from sneaking in and making an arrest. The fugitives fled north to San Carlos de Bariloche, where they embarked on a steamer, the Condor, across the Nahuel Huapi Lake. Now, some of you will recognize that town's name from Hunting Hitler. It is said Cassidy, Sundance, and Place, and an unknown male associate, robbed the Banco de la Nacion Argentina, a branch in Villa Mercedes, San Luis Province, on December 19th, about 450 miles west of Buenos Aires, taking 12,000 pesos. They fled across the Andes into Chile. June 30th, 1906, Place decided that she'd had enough of the life on the run, and so Sundance took her back to San Francisco. Cassidy obtained honest work under the alias Santiago Maxwell at the Concordia Tin Mine in Santa Vera Cruz range of the central Bolivian Andes. Once back from San Francisco, Sundance joined him. Their main duties included guarding the company's payroll. The two traveled to Santa Cruz in late 1907, a frontier town in Bolivia's eastern savanna, still wanting to settle down as respectable ranchers. A courier was carrying the payroll for the Aramayo, Frankie, and Sia silver mine on November 3rd, 1908, when he was attacked by two masked American bandits believed to be Cassidy and Sundance. Witnesses saw them 3 days later in San Vicente, where they lodged in a small boarding house owned by miner Bonifacio Casasola. Casasola became suspicious of them because they had a mule from the Aramayo mine. It had a very identifiable company brand. He notified the nearby telegraph office, who notified the Abaroya cavalry regiment stationed nearby. The unit dispatched 3 soldiers under the command of Captain Justo Concha, and they notified the local authorities. The soldiers, the police chief, the local mayor, and some of his officials all surrounded the lodging house on the evening of November 6th, intending to arrest the Aramayo bank robbers. Robbers. No bank involved. It was a courier. As they approached the house, the bandits opened fire, killing one of the soldiers and wounding another. This started a gunfight, which lasted for several hours into the night. At around 2 a.m., during a lull in the fighting, the mayor said he heard a man screaming several times inside the house. Then there were 2 successive gunshots. The authorities entered the house the next morning, where they found two bodies with numerous bullet wounds to the arms and legs. The man, assumed to be Sundance, had a bullet wound to the forehead, and the man thought to be Cassidy had a bullet hole to his temple. The local police report speculated, judging from the positions of the bodies, that Cassidy had probably shot the fatally wounded Sundance to put him out of his misery. Then he killed himself with his final bullet. The Tupiza police identified the bandits as the men who robbed the Aramayo payroll transport, but the Bolivian authorities did not know their real names, nor could they positively identify them. The two bodies were buried at the small San Vicente cemetery near the grave of a German miner named Gustav Zimmer. American forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow and his researchers attempted to find the grave in 1991, but they did not find any DNA evidence that matched any of the relatives of Cassidy or Sundance. In 2017, a new search was launched for Cassidy's grave, which zeroed in on a mine outside of Goodsprings, Nevada. The dig found human remains, but they did not match any DNA that was provided. Dr. Francis Smith said he had seen Cassidy, who told him that his face had been altered by a surgeon in Paris. He showed Smith an old bullet wound that Smith recognized as a wound that he had worked on. Josie Bassett said Cassidy came to visit her 1920s after returning from South America. She said he died in Johnny, Nevada in and around 1935. Residents in Cassidy's hometown of Circleville, Utah said he worked in Nevada until his death. Up until leaving the country, Cassidy was always one step ahead of the law. He planned things several steps in advance. That's why he was always able to get away. Do you think once he arrived in Bolivia, he all of a sudden just got stupid and began acting like a total dunderhead? In the movie, they show Butch and Sundance trying to rob a bank where nobody spoke English. Funny, but not what I would expect from such a good planner. The rich railroad owners and bankers all wanted Cassidy dead. The locals who knew him thought he was the nicest person, always willing to help out with cash if they needed it. John Dillinger was born June 22, 1903, at 2053 Cooper Street, Indianapolis, Indiana. He was the younger of two children born to John Wilson Dillinger and Mary Ellen Lancaster. I wonder if they're any relation to Elsa Lancaster. If you don't know who Elsa Lancaster was, go back and watch Bride of Frankenstein. His father was a grocer by trade and reportedly a kind of a harsh man. In an interview with reporters, Dillinger said his father was firm in his discipline and he believed in the adage, spare the rod and spoil the child. His mother died in 1907, just before his 4th birthday. That same year, Dillinger's older sister Audrey married Emmett Hancock. She cared for her brother for several years until their father remarried in 1912. As a teenager, Dillinger was frequently in trouble for fighting and petty theft. He was also noted for his bewildering personality. Some said he was a bit of a bully, while others said he was not much different from any other teenager living at the time. He quit school to work in an Indianapolis machine shop. Fearing the city was corrupting his son, Dillinger's father relocated the family to Morrisville, Indiana in 1921. Despite his new rural life, Dillinger's wild and rebellious behavior was unchanged. 1922, he was arrested for auto theft, and his relationship with his father began to deteriorate. 1923, Dillinger enlisted in the United States Navy, where he rose to the position of petty officer, third class, machinery repairman, assigned aboard the battleship USS Utah. He deserted from his ship when it was docked in Boston a few months into his service. He was eventually dishonorably discharged. Actually, I don't think he could have been a deserter because we weren't at war at the time. So he would have been AWOL. Dillinger returned to Morrisville where he met Beryl Ethel Hovius. The two married on April 12, 1924. Despite Dillinger's attempts to settle down, he found it difficult to find a job. He began planning a robbery with his friend, ex-convict Ed Singleton. Dillinger and Singleton robbed the Morrisville grocery store, stealing a grand total of $50. During the robbery, Dillinger struck a victim in the head with a machine bolt wrapped in cloth. He was also carrying a gun which accidentally went off. Nobody was hit. While leaving the scene, the criminals were seen by a minister who recognized the two men and reported them to the police. They were arrested the next day. Singleton pled not guilty, but after Dillinger's father discussed the matter with Morgan County prosecutor Omar O'Haro, Dillinger was convinced to confess to the crime and plead guilty without retaining an attorney. Dillinger was convicted for assault and battery with intent to rob and conspiracy to commit a felony. He expected a lenient sentence of maybe probation as a result of his father's discussion with O'Haro, but was sentenced instead to 10 to 20 years in prison. Dillinger's father told reporters he regretted his advice and he was appalled by this sentence, pleading with the judge to shorten the sentence to no avail. Incarcerated in the Indiana Reformatory and Indiana State Prison between 1924 and 1933, Dillinger developed a bit of a criminal lifestyle. Upon being admitted to prison, he was quoted as saying, "I will be the meanest so-and-so you've ever seen when I get out of here." His physical examination at the prison showed that he had a bit of a case of gonorrhea, the treatment for which was very painful at the time. He became resentful against society because of his long prison sentence, and he befriended all the other criminals, including seasoned bank robbers Harry Pete Pierpoint and Homer Van Meter, who taught Dillinger how to be a more successful criminal. Pierpoint and Van Meter hated each other, yet they both became good friends with Dillinger. Dillinger was liked by other criminals, most of the guards who were keeping him locked up, as well as the folks in charge. Well, the men planned heists that they would commit as soon as they were released. Dillinger also studied Herman Lamb's meticulous bank robbing system, and he used it exclusively throughout his criminal career. May 10th, 1933, after serving 9.5 years, Dillinger was paroled. Released at the height of the Great Depression, Dillinger had little prospect of finding employment, so he immediately went back to crime. June 21st, 1933, Dillinger committed his first ever bank robbery, stealing $10,000 from the Bank of New Carlisle, Ohio. August 14th, he robbed a bank in Bluffton, Ohio. Tracked by police from Dayton, he was captured and later transferred to the Allen County Jail in Lima to be indicted in connection to the Bluffton robbery. After searching him before putting him into the prison, the police discovered a document which appeared to be a prison escape plan. They demanded Dillinger tell them what the document meant, but he refused. Dillinger had helped conceive of a plan that was going to enable the escape of Pierpont, Clark, and 6 other men who were currently still in prison. He had friends smuggle guns into the cells, which they were then used to escape 4 days after Dillinger had been captured. Pierpont, Clark, and Mackley arrived in Lima on October 12, 1933, where they impersonated Indiana State Police officers, claiming that they had come to extradite Dillinger to Indiana. Pierpont wound up shooting the sheriff, and then he released Dillinger. Dillinger was a strange kind of crook. During a bank robbery, they encountered a farmer who had come to the bank to make a deposit. Dillinger asked the farmer if the money on the counter was his or the bank's. The farmer answered it was his, and Dillinger told him, "Put it back in your pocket. They only wanted the bank's money." Dillinger and his gang robbed a dozen banks in the Midwest region. In the process of stealing between $300,000 and $500,000, he also would destroy mortgage records. Farmers and small business owners would awake to find out that there was no longer any record of their owing money to the bank. That news was music to the ears of thousands of Americans suffering and struggling during the depths of the Depression. Dillinger became a hero. He was taking money from the banks at the time when poverty was at an all-time high, and many people benefited from him ruining the documents to their loans. The Dillinger gang robbed 12 banks between June 21st, 1933 and June 30th, 1934. January 25th, 1934, Dillinger and his gang were captured in Tucson, Arizona. Dillinger was extradited to Indiana. He was taken to Lake County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana, and jailed on charges of the murder of a policeman. Local police boasted to area newspapers that the jail was escape-proof and had posted extra guards as a precaution. Saturday, March 3rd, 1934, Dillinger was able to escape during morning exercises along with 15 other inmates. Dillinger had produced a pistol, catching the deputies and the guards by surprise, and he was able to leave the premises without ever firing a shot. According to Deputy Ernest Blunk, Dillinger had escaped using a real pistol. FBI files claim that Dillinger had used a fake pistol that was carved from wood. J. Edgar Hoover created a special task force headquartered in Chicago to locate Dillinger. July 21st, Anna Campanas, a madam, a lady of negotiable affections, from a brothel in Gary, Indiana, also known as the Woman in Red, contacted the FBI. She was a Romanian immigrant who was being threatened with deportation for low moral character, and she offered agents information on Dillinger in exchange for their helping her and preventing her from being deported. The FBI agreed to her terms, but she was later deported anyway. A team of federal agents and officers from the police forces from outside of Chicago was formed, along with a very small number of Chicago police. The Chicago police had a bit of a bad reputation when it came to dealing with gangsters. Dillinger, his rented girlfriend, and the woman in red went to see a movie. When the movie ended, Melvin Purvis was standing by the front door, and he signaled Dillinger's exit by lighting a cigar. Both he and the other agents reported that Dillinger turned his head, looked directly at the agent as he was walking by, glanced across the street, and then he began to run while trying to pull a pistol from his waistband. Others say that Dillinger did not recognize Purvis. Dillinger simply began walking along, turned into the alleyway where the shootout took place. Not quite as exciting, the civilian version of what happened. 3 men pursued Dillinger into the alley and began shooting. He was shot several times in the back, and he fell to the ground. 2 female bystanders who had nothing to do with Dillinger, Teresa Paulus and Etta Natalski, were both wounded, shot by the FBI agents. The FBI had only been allowed to carry guns since 1933. Agents were issued guns, but many of them were far from proficient in their use. Dillinger's body was available for public display at the Cook County morgue. An estimated 15,000 people viewed the corpse over the day and a half that it was there. As many as 4 death masks were also made. Oddly, Dillinger's father looked at the body and said, "That's not my son." Melvin Purvis, the FBI agent in charge that night in Chicago, may or have accidentally killed the wrong man. When Hoover took over the Bureau in 1924, replacing William Burns, the Bureau was a corrupt instrument of the Harding administration. FBI agents conducted widespread blackmail and extortion. Hoover was a control freak, and all agents had to answer directly to him on all major cases. Hoover wanted Dillinger dead. To build the image of an invincible bureau, Hoover spent much of his time controlling the public image and manipulating the press, the newspapers, and the radio stories. He cheated and lied in order to make the FBI's reputation far better than it was. Have you ever heard how Machine Gun Kelly said, "Don't shoot, G-men," as he was being arrested by the FBI? Well, he never said that. Memphis, Tennessee police detective Sergeant William Rainey had snuck into Kelly's bedroom on the night of September 26, 1933, stuck an automatic pistol to the kidnapper's head, and woke him up with a nudge. Kelly awoke and said, "Well, I've been expecting you fellows." Rainey marched him down to the Memphis police headquarters, where he was booked and then turned over to the FBI. Hoover invented that legend of Kelly saying, "Don't shoot, G-men," an outright lie, seeing as the FBI wasn't even present during the arrest. The only federal charges ever made against Dillinger was that he drove a stolen car across state line. This stolen car was what got Hoover to declare Dillinger public enemy number 1. A stolen car. It wasn't until 1934 that robbing a bank became a federal crime. When FDR read about Dillinger being compared to Robin Hood, Roosevelt called Hoover and told him, "Do something about that bank robber." Every time the publicity-conscious FDR read another story about Dillinger, and that was almost every day, he would call Hoover and ask, "What are you doing about this man?" Hoover latched onto the stolen car event and labeled Dillinger public enemy number one so he could concentrate his forces on him. He pressured Melvin Purvis, chief of the Chicago office, every day to get Dillinger and get him quick. In April 1934, Purvis got a tip that Dillinger and his gang were holed up in a lodge in Minnetonka Minnetonka Waters, Wisconsin. Purvis gathered every agent in the area and converged on the lodge early in the morning. With 20-some agents, Purvis and his men sprint out along the front of the little Bohemian lodge and waited. 3 men emerged from the lodge and got into a car. At no time did anyone announce the FBI was there. Nobody said, "Put up your hands, you're under arrest." Instead, as the engine started, Purvis shouted, "They're getting away! Let's have them! Let them have it!" Sorry about that. "They're getting away! Let them have it!" Let's have it. Oops, it's one of those mental things. Brain not connecting to mouth. Agents fired submachine guns, BARs, a Browning automatic rifle, rifles, pistols, and semi-automatic pistols. That's redundant. They fired revolvers and semi-automatic pistols. That car was shot to pieces, riddled with at least 200 bullets. Agents peppered the lodge with an unknown number of rounds. Purvis and some of his men ran up to the car and pulled open the doors. 2 badly wounded men fell out on the ground. Behind the wheel, his face mostly shot away, was a 3rd man, quite thoroughly dead. 2 reporters ran to the car, stopped in horror, and said, "You guys shot the wrong men. These are CCC workers." The CCC was the Civilian Conservation Corps, a voluntary government work relief program that ran from 1933 to 1942 for unemployed unmarried men ages 18 to 25. Purvis shouted to his agents to stop firing at the lodge, but this didn't happen for several minutes. Dillinger and his 2 accomplices had heard the shooting, and they'd slipped out a back window. All the agents were on the front side of the building. Really bad tactical planning, that. Purvis's FBI raid at the Little Bohemian was a total disaster. An innocent man had been killed and 2 others were badly wounded by a bunch of trigger-happy FBI agents. Hoover exploded, telling Purvis that if he did not capture Dillinger quickly, he would personally preside at Purvis's public execution. Crucifixion, not execution. Boy, I'm having a day today. It's all that bike riding I did earlier. Purvis was desperate, clutching at straws. When he heard that Dillinger just might be hanging out with a woman of negotiable affections, he pounced on it. The only identification made of Dillinger exiting the theater was the woman in red walking behind him. After the suspect was down, Purvis rolled the body over and one of his men said, "That doesn't look like Dillinger." Purvis did the only thing he could. He said Dillinger had had plastic surgery. The FBI would later use this excuse of plastic surgery to explain away the marked difference in the facial appearance of the dead man and John Dillinger. "Neat bit of plastic surgery, that," Purvis had said. Who was the man filled full of FBI bullets? Anna Sage and Polly Hamilton only knew him as James Lawrence, who said that he worked as a clerk at the Commodities Exchange in LaSalle Street. One story goes that Dillinger had paid $10,000 to find somebody that kind of looked like him so they could take the fall. Another says that the guy was what he said he was, never having any connection to Dillinger or any criminal gang. He was just another innocent man that got in the way of a bunch of trigger-happy agents. Dillinger and his gang robbed at least a dozen banks, and they netted a total of about $500,000, roughly $7 million in today's currency. The FBI spent $2 million. That's the equivalent of $46 million trying to catch him. Hoover was so focused on making the FBI into a shining star, he went a little overboard with things. It makes you wonder who the bad guys really were. Yes, Dillinger was a bank robber, and he robbed banks because he said that's where the money was. The FBI, who were supposed to be the good guys, shot and killed the wrong people on several occasions. They spent money like it wasn't being taken from citizens' pockets just to make themselves look good. Charles Arthur Floyd was born in Adairsville, Georgia, 1904. His family moved to Athens, Oklahoma, in 1911. I wish people would get some names and some locations that were easier to pronounce. They moved in 1911, and he grew up there. Working in the oil field, Charles would dress as if he was going to an office. Clean shirt, nice slacks. Other workers began calling him Pretty Boy. The name stuck despite Charles' dislike of it. He became known as Pretty Boy Floyd. Floyd got in trouble at the age of 18 for stealing $3.50 from a local post office. 3 years later, he was arrested for a payroll robbery, September 16th, 1925, in St. Louis, Missouri, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Times were hard. Work was scarce. People were desperate, and some turned to crime. Floyd joined a bunch of criminals in the Kansas City underworld after his parole. He committed a series of bank robbers over the next several years. 1929, Floyd was wanted in numerous cases. March 9th, he was arrested in Kansas City on an investigation, and again May 7th for vagrancy and suspicion of highway robbery, but he was released the next day. 2 days later, he was arrested in Pueblo, Colorado, and charged with vagrancy. He was fined $50 and sentenced to 60 days in jail. Floyd was arrested in Akron, Ohio, March 8, 1930, under the alias Frank Mitchell, and he was charged with the murder of an Akron police officer who had been killed during a robbery. He was arrested in Toledo, Ohio, for bank robbery and murder on May 20th. He was convicted of a Sylvania, Ohio bank robbery and sentenced on November 24th, 1930 to 12 to 15 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary, but he escaped. Floyd was a suspect in the death of Kansas City brothers Wally and Bowl Ash, who were rum runners found dead in a burning car March 25th, 1931. Former Sheriff Irv Kelly of McIntosh County, Oklahoma, was shot by Floyd while he was trying to arrest him on April 7, 1932. Despite his life of crime, Floyd was viewed positively by the general public. When he robbed banks, He also would destroy mortgage documents, just like Dillinger had done. Most folks hated the banks. Mortgages were being foreclosed on just about every week. Farmers were losing their land as bankers were getting rich. There were no options for most people. Deal with the banks or starve. There were no when one of the many gang running around would walk in and rob a place, they were seen as heroes by many. Floyd was often protected by locals of Oklahoma who referred to him as the Robin Hood of Cookson Hills. Floyd and Adam Ritchie became the primary suspects in a gang fight known as the Kansas City Massacre, June 17, 1933, which resulted in the deaths of 4 law enforcement officers. J. Edgar Hoover leveraged the incident to seek more authority to pursue Floyd, although historians are divided as to whether Floyd was even involved. The gunfight was an attack by Vernon Miller and accomplices on lawmen who were escorting robber Frank Jelly Nash to a car parked at the Union Station in Kansas City, Missouri. 2 Kansas City detectives, an Oklahoma police chief, and an FBI agent were all killed. Nash was also killed while he was sitting in the car, accidentally shot in the head by one of his would-be rescuers. 2 other Kansas City police officers survived by slumping forward in the back seat and pretending to be dead. An unnamed witness named Floyd and Ricchetti as being the gunmen, and Hoover decided they were guilty. The man identified as being Floyd was wounded in the shoulder by one of the police officers. Floyd had no such injury. Kansas City police received a postcard June 30th, 1933, from Springfield, Missouri, that read, "Dear Sirs, I, Charles Floyd, want to make it known that I did not participate in the massacre of officers at Kansas City. Signed, Charles Floyd." The police department believed that this note was genuine. Floyd also reportedly denied involvement in the massacre to the agents who eventually captured him. That's not the right word, but the agents who finally got him. J. Edgar Hoover named Floyd as public enemy #1 following the death of John Dillinger. Local police and FBI agents led by Melvin Purvis, under the direct supervision of Inspector Samuel P. Cowley, shot Floyd on October 22, 1934, in a cornfield in East Liverpool, Ohio. Accounts differ on who shot him and the manner in which he died. Floyd and Ricchetti had left Buffalo, New York, October 18th, and their vehicle slid into a telephone pole in a heavy fog at about 3 a.m. the following morning. Nobody was injured, but the car was disabled. So they sent their 2 female companions to get a tow truck. They planned to have the women accompany the tow truck driver into town and have the vehicle repaired while they waited on the roadside. A farmer and his son saw Floyd and Ricchetti sitting on the side of the road. They looked suspicious, so the farmer reported this to the police. When officers arrived at the scene, both men took off running. Floyd may have exchanged shots with the pursuing officers, and one of the police officers was hit in the foot, or he may have accidentally shot himself. The officers went back to town, and there were no radios to use at the time, and they rounded up a posse. With more men on hand, they began searching the woods for the two bank robbers. Ricchetti was arrested, but Floyd managed to slip away. Floyd was able to hitch a ride to East Liverpool, Ohio, where he obtained food at a pool hall owned by a friend of his named Charles Joy. From here, things get a bit mixed up. Floyd was confronted by a group of lawmen soon after leaving the pool hall. He attempted to flee on foot. He was shot 2 times and wounded. Unable to run any further, so they arrested him, handcuffed him, and formally placed him in custody. Once more, Melvin Purvis was in charge of the men trying to arrest Floyd. The FBI say they were the only ones there at the time. They pursued Floyd, and the suspect was shot and killed while trying to escape. East Liverpool Police Captain Chester Smith described events somewhat differently. He said he had deliberately wounded Floyd, but had not killed him. He also said he knew that Purvis couldn't hit him, so I dropped him with 2 shots from my .32 Winchester rifle. Floyd was handcuffed and about to be taken in when Purvis said, "I told you we wanted him dead." And he shot Floyd, making sure this time. Floyd's body was embalmed and briefly viewed at the Sturgis Funeral Home in East Liverpool, Ohio, before being sent on to Oklahoma. His body had been on public display in Silesaw, Oklahoma. His funeral was attended by 40,000 people, and it remains the largest funeral in Oklahoma history. He was buried in Athens, Oklahoma. A Cowboy Bob was 5'10", dressed like a cowboy, and robbed 5 banks. He never spoke. He never said anything to anyone. He would simply hand over a note saying, "This is a bank robbery," and he would always be sure to take the note back before he left. The FBI had absolutely no leads in this case until Cowboy Bob slipped up and used his own car for the last robbery. What blew away the G-men was he ran the plates on Cowboy Bob's vehicle, and he discovered that Cowboy Bob wasn't a he, but a she. Peggy Jo Tollis was born in Kaufman, Texas, June 6, 1944, to Pete Tollis Sr. and Helen Faye Tollis. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her father died of cancer when she was 4 years old, which resulted in her mother having to get a job as a nurse's aide in order to support the family. Tollis was a free-spirited teenager, unlike the rest of the family, and she dropped out of high school in the 10th grade. She was constantly on the go, always looking for new adventures. Her sister, Karen Jones Tollis, try that one more time. Her sister, Karen Joan Tollis's childhood friend, recalled that one day Tollis hopped in her car and decided to drive to San Francisco because she wanted to see what life was like out there. Her favorite movie of all times was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. In her 20s, she moved to North Dallas and got a job as a receptionist at the Marriott Hotel. While working at the hotel, she became close friends with another receptionist named Sherry Young. Young said Tollis had no desire to get married or to ever have children, nor did she think about a career or money. One afternoon, while the two were driving, they passed a Wells Fargo armored truck, and Tollis said, "You know, I could rob that and not have to worry about anything for a while." Young laughed, not thinking twice about what Tallis had said. Years passed, and Tallis's friends had all gotten married and were raising kids. Tallis had had a bad run-in with a man, and she decided to simply avoid them at all costs. 1977, Tallis was arrested in Tarrant County for auto theft. 1984, her mother was suffering with a bone disease, and Tallis moved her to a Dallas suburb. The medical bills kept piling up. Tallis felt like she was falling behind and she could not catch up, and she was too proud to ask for any help from the government. May 1991, wearing a pair of men's pants, dark man's shirt, a brown leather jacket, a fake beard, aviator sunglasses, and oversized riding boots, and a cowboy hat, Tallis walked into an American Federal Bank in Irving, Texas. With her head down, she walked up to the teller and slid her a note which said, "This is a bank robbery. Give me your money. No marked bills or dye package." The teller handed over her money as she was instructed, and the robbery note as well. After her first success, Tallis continued to rob banks all around the Dallas area, as well as Garland and Mesquite, using the same disguise. The press began calling her Cowboy Bob, thinking she was a he. She was careful not to make any small mistakes, leaving the FBI with no leads. September 1992, after robbing many banks, Tallis committed 2 robberies in one day. She used her personal vehicle without changing the license plates. It was traced back to her apartment. Tallis was sentenced to 33 months in prison. After her release, she returned home to her mother and continued to care for her until her mother died on December of 2002. May 5th, 2005, Tallis drove her RV to the Guarantee Bank in Tyler, Texas. She told a young teller, "This is a robbery. I need all your money. Don't set off any alarms." Tallis got the money but failed to check for the dye pack, which exploded when she left the bank. The smoke caught the attention of pedestrians and law enforcement was notified. The police found her in her RV and they surrounded it. Tallis came out the door, telling the police she had a gun and that they'd have to kill her. When they refused, she pulled her pistol. The police opened fire, hitting Tallis many times. She was dead before she hit the ground. It turned out Tallis didn't own a gun. She had always used a toy pistol. She's buried at Kaufman Cemetery in her hometown. History is not just written by the victors, but the folks with money or easy access to the press. If the head of the FBI says a bank robber was shot while trying to escape, most folks wanted to believe it. The easiest lies to tell are the ones that people want to believe. Those in power don't want people running around making them look bad. They do that well enough on their own. The government hates crime because, well, they don't like the competition. If you lie to Congress, it's a crime. If they lie to us, it's simply politics. Congress passed the Truth in Advertising Act in 2014. It said anybody making claims had to be able to back them up. They also conveniently put a clause in there that stated politicians were exempt from that law. Makes you wonder, why would they do something like that? Unless... Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell people they should be listening as well. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Thing.
coming to the tree, where there strung up a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.